Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. Now, you don't see me do this very often because we hardly ever water the borders here at Longmeadow. But I'm watering this banana. This is an insetti, and it will grow huge, but it's thirsty and greedy. And at this stage, because it's been out a few weeks now and it's just started to grow, this is when it needs a really good drink. And although our soil is very moisture retentive and heavy, it is bone dry, and I guess other parts of the country it's drier still. And it's been hard to get used to that because it was so wet all over winter that throughout spring we were just glad when it didn't rain. But it's hardly rained here at all for weeks now. So I'm giving the banana a soak, and I'll soak the cannas too, because they're another plant that really likes it to be wet. But if you are going to water your borders, don't use a sprinkler. Water the soil, not the plants, because if you water in the air, it just lands on the foliage and the flowers and evaporates off. But if you water at the roots, you use half as much water and have twice as much effect. On today's programme, we join Nick, making the most of extra time at home to finally get his own back garden in order.
Now, luckily, I'm starting with a fairly blank canvas, and I want to make the most of every single centimetre that I've got.
Carol celebrates the versatility of the hardy geranium.
There was a time when geraniums fell out of fashion, but you can't keep a good classic down. Geraniums are back, and this is their time, June.
And I shall be planting out some tender annuals here in the jewel garden, as well as planting ground cover in the orchard beds. We started to make the herb garden about 3 years ago, and most of it is great, and I'm completely happy with it, and that's the bit in sunshine. But this half of the herb garden, which is in deep shade, has been more problematic. We wanted to make it different, and what we realised was going wrong was that we were trying to be too bitty. Eat all should be herbs, and if you've got a shady garden, you still can grow herbs. Now, these herbs mostly come from the Northern Hemisphere, so they can take a richer soil, they can be slightly wetter, and crucially, they can take more shade. I'm starting with this. This is sorrel, and I've dug it up from another part of the garden, trying to set seed. So what I would do is cut it right back, and then we get the lovely fresh leaves that taste lemony and slightly bitter, and wonderful with eggs, and add that sharp, piquant taste. When you're moving any mature plant at this time of year, you're almost always going to have to cut it back. By digging up the roots, you are traumatizing it, and then if it has to support lots of foliage, that is not going to work, either for the foliage or the roots. So we'll just cut that right back like that. Sorrel is a plant that likes plenty of moisture, not too much sun, so perfect for this type of planting. I'll put it in the middle. And if you're thinking the soil looks really good, it should do, because I spent all day yesterday digging, adding compost, adding grit, and preparing it. We'll put that in there like that. Right, that's the centerpiece, and those leaves will grow about a foot or so tall before they start to produce their flower stems. And you can keep cutting it back. You can cut that back about 2, 3, even 4 times in a season. A very well-known herb, quite happy in some shade, is parsley. And a parsley hedge works really well. So I'll pop that in there like that. It makes quite a robust plant. One parsley plant can be that big and that wide. And again, like the sorrel, you can cut it back 2 or 3 times before it decides to set seed and grow a flowering stem. Parsley responds well to having plenty of nutrition and water. So don't let it dry out. The next plant is one of my culinary favourites. It's tarragon. And tarragon is delicious, made as a sauce with chicken. If you're planting tarragon to use in the kitchen, you must be careful that you choose French tarragon, not Russian. Russian tarragon looks lovely, but its taste is not nearly so good, even though it's tough enough to take any kind of cold. Whereas French tarragon won't survive a long meadow winter, but it will grow in partial shade. This is a little pot of chives, and there's no reason why I can't plant it out into almost full shade. Chives are really adaptable, really tough. And you can see, poor thing, look at that, the roots, completely root bound. But I'll break it into two. Like that. Now, chives, like sorrel, grow back really well when they're cut back, literally in a few days. Now, this is a plant that I actually don't really think of as a herb. It's Filipendula, meadowsweet, and it grows in damp hollows and woodland. But it used to be part of every herb garden for its medicinal qualities. And I think that by having a herb garden that doesn't just have the sage and the rosemary and the thyme and the parsley, but also some of those herbs that look great, really add something to it. I'm sure that the reason why I've rethought out the herb garden and then worked out how I want it to be is simply because I've had time. And that's been the case with Nick in his own garden. As a garden designer, he's got lots of ideas, but now he's had the time to put them into practice.
Like so many gardeners and garden designers, I spend my life travelling all over the country creating gardens for other people. So much so that sadly my own plot over the last few years has become quite neglected. But this window of time that we've been afforded has meant I've finally been able to get on with sorting out my own garden. Now, I've been doing it for the last few weeks, being able to get my hands into the soil and really think about how I'm going to make the most of this plot. I have to say, I am absolutely loving it. Inevitably, my plot here in London isn't particularly big. It's about 11 metres by 10. Luckily, I'm starting with a fairly blank canvas, and I want to make the most of every single centimetre that I've got. Now, unusually for me, as a plantsman, I'm actually going to be growing a larger proportion of fruit and vegetables. Of course, there will be a concession to some ornamental plants, but predominantly it's going to be fruit and veg, which will keep me in food all the way through until autumn. When I first moved here, this place was a mess. I added a garden office quite quickly, but I haven't had time to do much more. However, over the last few weeks, I've made my way through the garden, dug out all the perennial weeds. So now I'm ready to start thinking about how I'm going to lay out the garden. The first thing to do when you're designing a garden is to assess your site. What you want to leave and what can go. In my case, I'll be keeping the shed, the fence, and the terrace. Then, work out which are the windy, sheltered, or sunny spots, and this will inform where you put your plants and where you can place things like a seating area. Give yourself a bit of space and time to consider those ideas. Now, I've had about 3 years to do that, so hopefully I'll get it right. I've put in all the key elements I need for the garden. The glasshouse is going to sit just here, potato patch behind it over there, ornamental bed in the centre just here, my steps moving up through here to link the hut back to the house. And this over here is the bulk of the garden, which is where I'm putting the vegetables. Now, absolutely key to the design of this garden is the light. Unfortunately, the property's north-facing, so that really limits things, but I do get a window of 6 hours of light, which comes into this area of the garden. In other words, the place where I've chosen to put the veg in, and anything that says it needs full sunshine does mean a minimum of 6 hours of light. So ideal over there. Also trying to take advantage of this back corner over here. The sun doesn't rise over the top of the property until about mid-May, which is exactly when the potatoes will be pushing out of the ground. So it takes advantage of that growing pattern and means I can really maximise cropping and aesthetics across the whole garden. I'm going to put in some of my favourite ornamentals to give the garden a lift, such as Salvia amistad, Echinacea white swan, Geranium roseanne, and Gora. But that's all for later. As my garden's sloping, I'll terrace it, which will also help me to maximise growing space. And today, I'm going to continue building one of the 2 new paths along the terrace. When it comes to laying out paths and terraces, there are a certain few basic dimensions it's worth being aware of. So if you're looking for a single path, about 1.20 meters is an ideal width. I've got a little bit skinnier here because I want to maximise the growing space. The next thing to consider is materials. Being London, I've decided on a brick or a paving block that's got that sort of typical London clay look to it. They're lovely, they're really variable. I think they'll work together quite nicely. The other material I've decided to go for are these new cedar sleepers, and they're good in so many different ways. They've got this lovely tan tone to them, which makes a fantastic contrast to the black of the hut. I've used these both as the retaining edges for the paths, but they will also produce the terracing to layer up the garden and the steps as well. The first part of the process is to get the foundations or the base sorted out. Now you can get hold of various different sub-bases from a local builder's merchant. I've decided to save money, and so the old patio that I've broken up has all gone into here. It's been completely compacted down, and so that works as an ideal foundation. Next thing to do is to get this stuff on, which is sharp sand. It's lightly damped down, so it sort of holds together as a ball like this. Doesn't want to be dripping, just so it combines, and that will help when it compacts down to make it as firm as possible. The next thing to do is to start to get a level surface. So I know all of this is really compacted down here. It's tamped and firm and ready to go. So I'm ready to start putting the pavers down. So I'm just going to gently settle that in there, sliding its way down, and you can see that's near perfect on the top there. If you're using mixed brick with different colours, do just double check as you go that you don't get a load of white bricks or a load of buff bricks right next to each other. This bit is fast, and I think quite fun as well. Last 2 bricks going in. If I've got my measurements right, this one should just slot in. Let's see. Yep. I'd normally brush in kiln-dried sand to bind bricks, but as it's unavailable, I'm using sharp sand instead. Well, I reckon it's about half an hour to finish this path off, but for me, it's all about the plants. Over here, I have got the veg, which is going to go into the garden. I've sown a few things inside, but really I need the glass house, which is going to sit right here to do the bulk of sowing. So to get myself slightly ahead of the game, I've got some plug plants here. I've got a real interesting mix. So I've got broad beans, spinach, lettuce, peas, beetroot, and broccoli. So with that mix of plants and everything else I'm going to sow, it's going to give me a sumptuous feast of food, which will take me all the way through to the autumn.
Now, many of us won't do it with quite the same amount of expertise, but I do know that tens of thousands of people have started to grow vegetables for the first time, and that can only be a good thing, because growing good vegetables is one of life's greatest pleasures. Now, I'm growing some mint here, and mint is one of those plants that you do not want to plant out into a border. It should always be grown in a container because it is one of the most invasive plants that there is. If mint gets established, you're really pushed to get rid of it. So I've got some black peppermint. It likes good drainage, but also a fairly rich soil. So I've used potting compost with a little bit of garden compost added to it. And what I like about mint in pots is it grows tall. When it flowers, it looks very decorative. You can cut it back and it will regrow. And mint will grow in sun or shade. I'll keep this well watered, and this will get established in a matter of weeks, and that will give us masses of delicious fresh mint to drink. Now, a few weeks ago, Nick showed us how to recycle a pallet to make a cold frame. And we've had a film from Catherine Hubbard and Claire Butler on further ideas on how to use pallets so that they are useful and beautiful in the garden.
Hello everyone, my name's Catherine. I live in Ash, which is 6 miles outside of Guildford. I live here with my wife Claire, our dog Pig, and 2 little hens. I just wanted to show you a few things today that show what me and Claire have done around the garden to use mainly old pallets. So this is our first one. This is a sort of a shelved pallet that we've then mounted on the wall and we use as like a little herb garden. We've also used Claire's little planter here, you made from pallets on top of another pallet to make sure that the little sort of grow box here doesn't get sort of rotted or anything like that. Today we're just going to be making a simple planter like this one here.
What's quite nice about making the planters from the pallets is part of it's already built for you. So if you take a look at the pallet on the front there, the feet of the pallet and the base, there's actually 3 of those which form the sides of your planter, which you can see already has the space for planting, but we need a base for it. To make that, you can just get another piece of wood which you salvage from the pallet, and you just cut it down to size, and then you just attach it. Once the base is attached, you'll need to line your planter with something which helps to hold the soil in place. We happen to have some damp-proof membrane from when our shed was built. You just cut that down to size and then secure it into your planter. And once you've filled it with soil, you can then plant it up with anything you like. We've got alpines planted in this one and herbs planted in this one.
That's all from us. Hope you have a lovely weekend. Bye!
I think that most of us have found that we can't get hold of what we want in the garden and sometimes what we need, but it is extraordinary what you can do with a bit of ingenuity. And along the same lines, a good way to make new plants is to get one large one and then subdivide it. Now, you may have that in your garden. You could dig it up and you can split it into pieces. But if you go to a garden centre, they very often have large plants that are good material for dividing. Take this gym. This is pink petticoats, and it would cost you about 10 quid in the garden centre. But if you see it as stock in which to build new plants, it becomes really good value. So if you take it out of the pot, like that, you can see that there's a root system that goes right the way around the outside. But instead of potting it on, I'm going to break it up into lots of different pieces. Now, when the roots aren't as tight as this, you'll find you can literally pull it apart. But when there's so much root, that can be a job. So I'm going to start by cutting it. So if you saw into the plant, and then if I get my thumbs in there, I can start to tease that apart. Now, you can see there are 2 shoots. So I'd leave that and put that aside as one. And you can see there's a really solid bit of woody root there, but all this is dense root. So in order to break it up, I want to get in here. And you can see I'm being quite robust with this, but the plant will survive. There we go. We've got ourselves a good-sized plant there, and I think that could be subdivided again by cutting down the middle. So if I put that in there, and I pop these on and grow them for about a month or so. And the best time to do this is probably a little earlier in the season, but of course we couldn't, because we couldn't get to garden centres. Hi, Patty. You coming to help? I'm going to take off the flowering stems because that means the energy can go into establishing new roots rather than flowers. Right, 4 plants for the price of 1. I've got here an ajuga, a low ground-covering plant, little blue flowers, and this lovely purpley bronzy foliage. But like the geum, it is in need of breaking up. And that will form 1 plant, so we'll pop that in there. The plants that divide best are those with fibrous roots. Hardy geraniums, for example, are ideal because they just pull apart into sections. Or with very solid roots that you can cut. So, for example, hostas are really good because they can be chopped up. And as long as there's a section of the root with a bud, that will make a new plant. And I will plant these out when there's a decent root system filling the pot. Now, a couple of years ago, we went to Wolverhampton to visit the garden of Anne and Brian Bailey because they had taken what was a fairly ordinary back garden and transformed it utterly.
Well, we call it the Garden of Surprises because the idea is that as you go round the garden, you come round a corner and go, oh, I wasn't expecting that. We first moved here in 1990. The garden was just lawn and conifers and nothing else really. We wanted it to be a garden where you couldn't see it all in one go. We wanted to try and divide it up. And so it gradually evolved. There wasn't a plan, was there? I'm the creative director, and I'm particularly interested in the different uses of plants, but also the myths that exist about the plants in the countries that they came from.
My role is more mundane in that someone has to do all of the maintenance and the propagation. When we've agreed that we need a structure in the garden, I'm the one that builds it.
A lot of the enclosure of the garden is actually coming from borrowed trees in neighbouring gardens, which helps give it its special atmosphere.
The 2 issues with the trees is dryness and light for growing plants underneath them.
One of the obvious things to do was to put some structures in where we couldn't grow anything.
I've been to Japan a couple of times and was inspired by their gardening. I built this Japanese tea house and we've picked a range of plants and arranged them that gives a Japanese flavour to it. With the different types of bamboo we've got 3 or 4 aces here. We've brought some features such as the dragon.
This is the Indian ink plant, and it comes from North America. It's also called pokeweed. It has spikes of white flowers, and then it has these wonderful red berries that go black over time. It does this in one season. It's quite good-tempered, part shade. It's not especially bothered about moisture. This is another interesting group of plants, agaves. They come from Mexico and Middle America and they grow in the desert. They can make agave syrup and they can also produce sisal to make textiles with. We have all sorts of interesting comments from visitors to the garden. Some of them I find wandering around in the middle of the garden saying, "I'm lost, where am I?" Which is really what we're trying to achieve, that people are in another world. The folly, which looks like the corner of a monastery, somebody said to me, "Oh, I didn't know there was a ruined monastery in Wolverhampton." I said, "Well, there isn't."
The inspiration for the summer house came from Castle Coch, where we liked the arts and crafts effect that was created. It's been built with reclaimed stone and reclaimed doors and windows from a very old summer house that stood here, and hopefully it gives a very warm feeling when you can sit here on a late afternoon with the sun and have a view of the summer house border and the mock folly at the bottom. This is the 1939 brick air raid shelter, which, as you can see, we've turned into a shell grotto. The themes are designed by Anne and represent fire, earth, air and water, and day and night. The time it took to do this was probably 7 years. It was one of those things where you start off with a good idea and then much later you suddenly think, why on earth did we get into this? But you can't get out of it.
A smallish suburban garden doesn't have to be boring. We're only a mile and a half away from the town centre, but you just feel as if you're in another world because of the way it wraps round you. That's what a garden needs to be. It needs to take you to another place.
Certainly gardens can take you somewhere else, but also they can take you home. I always feel that the core of my existence is right here in this garden. And right now, at this time of year, it starts to be filled with these rich but bright colours. And the plant that exemplifies that for me more than anything else are delphiniums. And these here in the Jewel Garden have grown without any trouble for the last 10 years, practically untouched. They just grow and they flower. And when they finish flowering, I cut them back to the ground, clear it all away, and then the regrowth will produce fresh flowers at the end of summer in late August and September. Of course, the power of delphiniums comes almost entirely through your eyes. It's colour that you see. But sight alone is only part of the picture. And this is particularly true of the film that we were sent by the Bruti family, because their daughter Florence has to experience the garden in all kinds of other ways.
Hello, we're the Bruti family, and this is our family garden.
I've been gardening for over 15 years. Since having a young family, I've had to change my approach somewhat.
Our alpine collection's grown and grown. They're one plant that can really take a hit from a basketball. The trunk of this olive tree was snapped in two. It had a paddling pool dragged over it. Luckily I got there in time and I just taped it together and staked it, and it's fused together beautifully. One good tip I read about was making a child-friendly pond out of an old washing up bowl. It's surprising how many birds come to it for bathing and drinking.
Oh, there's a spider, Dad. I see it. A spider in there. A creature. It's flying away.
Florence, our oldest daughter, is blind. She has an altogether different experience of the garden.
Oh, what's that? Somebody's drink.
Today we've come over to listen to the bees in the echium and all the birds in the sycamore tree. Last year I started coming into the garden at night. Initially it was to shake earwigs off my dahlias, but as time went on I started really appreciating it as a quiet time and a beautiful time as well. I think having a daughter like Florence makes you really appreciate everything. And I think certainly for us, having a garden is the biggest thing really we could be grateful for.
I think the important message is that all of us should enjoy our gardens as much as we possibly can in any and every way. And hopefully a lot of us are going to be enjoying a good fruit year this year because the signs are very good. These are loganberries and I keep having to tie them in because they're very vigorous and they flop and they arch, but they're forming good fruit, as are the apples and the pears, raspberries, gooseberries, and I've got blueberries growing in plastic pots. And the reason why I grow blueberries in pots, by the way, is because they really must have ericaceous soil. And our soil here at Longmeadow is neutral, which is not really acidic enough for them. So I'm growing them in a bark-based compost and watering them wherever possible with rainwater collected in water butts. And the reason you do that is because quite a lot of tap water, depending on the area you live in, has got a lot of lime in it, and they hate lime. However, when it's dry and you've run out of rainwater, far better to water them with tap water, even if it is limey, than not water them at all. Now, still to come on today's programme. Carol revels in the colourful beauty of hardy geraniums. But first we join Claire Reid, who sent us this film from her home at Kinghorn in Fife.
Hi, my name's Claire. This is my garden, and I've been spending a lot more time here recently. One of the first things that I did was to dig up most of the grass in my back garden to turn it into a veggie patch. I usually do outdoor learning and therapeutic play in nature with kids, and at the moment I'm sending them videos to give them ideas for things that they can do outside. So today I'm going to be filming something about a disgusting seaweed mixture that I've made for my garden. So I'm going to check out how my seaweed fertiliser is coming on. absolutely stinks. To make this, I collected seaweed that had washed up on the shore. It's really important never to cut seaweed. It's a living thing and a really important part of the marine ecosystem. And seaweed is about 10 times more rich in minerals than land-based plants. So I collected that up and gave it a rinse at home and then put it in water and left it covered for a couple of weeks. And now it's really powerful stuff. And what is going to happen is when I dilute this with water, it's a really nice organic natural fertiliser that I can put on the ground. So I'm just going to pour it in my watering can. I'm going to give this ground a little bit of a treat, possibly attract some blue bottles because it smells so bad. This garden is a home for nature because every bird, bug and bee and plant that people might think is a weed has its place and an important role to play.
I am a huge fan of seaweed feed, although I've never made my own. If you are thinking of making your own and gathering seaweed, just bear in mind that there are really quite strict guidelines about what you can collect, when you can collect it, and where. And if you're not absolutely certain of what those are, then go to our website where there are links you can follow. Now, this is the moment when really the jewel garden shifts. We go from the spring flowers, of which the allium purple sensation is the last, to summer. And it's time to start planting tender annuals. So I've got some zinnias here and tithonia. So I need to start pulling out things like the forget-me-nots just to make room. So I'm going to pull them up. Go. That ground is hard. Now, the upside of this drought is that for a plant like zinnia, they are well adapted to heat. They come from Central America, and this is a variety called Orange King. I sowed this earlier this spring, and that's got a good root system. I always get a little sort of burst of pleasure when I see a plant that is really healthy, that I've grown from seed. Okay, in you go. Over to you now. So we'll put a little group of these in. And in this country, in a normal summer, these will grow twice as big as that, and then they will produce flowers, as long as I keep deadheading, right through into October. There you go. Right, behind that, I'm going to put a tithonia. Now, tithonia, or the Mexican sunflower, has probably got the most intense orange of any plant that you can grow. I absolutely love them. I've always grown them, and they always do me proud. This can grow fully 5 foot tall, so it's quite a statuesque plant, and they'll be multi-stemmed, and these will flower absolutely from August through even till early November if the frosts don't come. So we only need one in here, just behind these zinnias. Now behind it, I've got this Salvia amistad. It got hit by frost, so I've cut it right back, but it'll regrow. It'll be fine, it's not killed. And this will grow tall with a mass of deep purple flowers. And contrasted with the orange of the tithonia and the zinnia, you will get real intensity of colour. And using colour that way, putting colour opposites together, increases the vibrance of both of them. And of course, when I finish planting, I will water these in really well. Now, a few years ago, Carol celebrated a plant that is not as flamboyant as these particular jewel garden plants and their intense colours, but nevertheless is rich with its own special charm.
The month of June sees our gardens awash with glorious perennials. It's really difficult to choose a favourite. But perhaps the star of the show is the geranium. The geranium family is large and varied. Most come from the Northern Hemisphere, where they're found in almost every kind of habitat. The great majority of them are completely hardy. There are certain characteristics that all geraniums have in common. The most obvious, perhaps, is their leaves. They're always palmate, just like your hand, made up of 5 lobes. And then there are the flowers. They all have 5 petals, and those petals are not joined at the base, they're completely separate. And the colour range within geraniums is right the way from white to pinks, magentas, blues, but it doesn't contain any of those fiery colours. Geraniums take their name from geranos, the Greek for a crane. And you can see why if you look at the seed pod with this great extended rostrum here. It looks just like that bird's head. This is in fact a really clever device for distributing seed. And at its base are clustered 5 seeds right the way round it. Those seeds are green at the moment, but eventually they ripen to brown. At this stage, this rostrum divides into 5 separate pieces, and each one curls up with its seed contained within it, and it thrusts the seeds into the air, catapults them here and there all around. So they come up as new plants. It's a really brilliant mechanism. Flowering from late spring through to autumn, hardy geraniums have got to be some of the most hard-working plants in our gardens. They're a doddle to grow, not usually fussy about where they put down the roots, but it's worth adding organic matter when you're planting, and perhaps some grit if your soil's on the heavy side. There are several different methods to make more geraniums. Probably the easiest of them is from seed. There are a few geraniums that are sterile and just don't produce any seed, but the great majority do. And these are some that I collected from Geranium pretense, the meadow cranesbill. When you're collecting your seed, take your cue from Mother Nature. Keep a watchful eye on them, and when you see those seed pods starting to turn brown and the first ones beginning to catapult here, there and everywhere, move in with your paper bags. You can actually put the paper bag over the top and tie it round with a bit of string and wait for them to explode in the bag. These have been stored since last year, but they'll last for quite a long time. They're quite big seeds. So if you've got a half seed tray like this, you can actually station sow them. You can see where each of those seeds is going, and you can space them out properly. And I'm not going to push them down, press them in or anything. All I'm going to do is cover them with grit. And they should germinate in a matter of weeks. You don't need any extra heat, you don't need to put them in a propagator or anything. Just on a greenhouse bench or even just outside. There's another way of propagating some geraniums. This works particularly well for forms of Geranium sanguineum, the bloody cranesbill. These geraniums live often in very sandy soils, just below the surface of the soil. Thick roots run around, and you can exploit that by digging a few of them up, chopping them up in chunks and turning them into root cuttings. Well, I've got a couple of nice hefty pieces here. Now, you'd normally do this during the dormant season, from sort of November right the way through till March, but it'll work at any time of year. Thing is, you don't really want to disturb your plants, but if I just take a couple of these pieces off like this, and if you look at this, it's got nodules all the way along the surface, and each one of those is capable of making a new shoot and producing new roots to keep it going. So you just chop it up in chunks, probably a couple of inches, 5 centimetres or so long, and then you lay those chunks on top of a seed tray or a pot full of gritty compost. bit of grit on the top of them to weight them down. Although it looks like 3 little bits of root now, that's potentially 3 new geraniums. There's no more dependable or useful all-rounder in the garden than a geranium. One of the most widely used of all cranesbills are forms of Geranium oxonianum. Invariably their flowers are some shade of mouth-watering pink. This cranesbill, Geranium Ann Thompson, spreads out to make a healthy mound, about 1 metre across. Because it's a sterile hybrid, there's no reason for it to stop flowering, and it produces its gorgeous magenta flowers with distinctive black eyes for months on end. There was a time when geraniums fell out of fashion, upstaged by the latest trendy plants. But you can't keep a good classic down. Geraniums are back, and this is their time, June.
Geraniums are never the star of any border, but every border is better for them, and I love them. I grow lots here at Longmeadow and will be planting lots more at every opportunity. In fact, I've got some to add to this border here. Now, this is what we call the berry border. Planted it at the very end of last year with the idea of growing as many berries as possible to feed the birds. Most of the winter, half of it was underwater. The water came up to this level here. You could swim where I'm standing now. Now it's dried out, and the result is the top part is completely dry, and we have soil that looks like lumps of concrete hardcore. This is hard stuff. So it'll take quite a few years of heavy mulching for that to develop into a good tilth. So I need tough plants to go in there. I've got 3 plants here that are essentially ground cover. They are plants that tend to grow horizontally more than they grow upwards. And this is Vinca minor. And it's a classic ground cover plant. It's got lovely little white flowers, and they have long tendrils that spread out. And they're really good for growing in shade, dry shade, or even slightly damp shade, and covering areas which otherwise tend to just fill up with a scattering of weeds. The only thing I would say with many ground cover plants is be careful what you wish for, because once they take hold, they really will cover the ground, and not much else gets a look in. And these will spread to about 2 foot in each direction. I've dug up a geranium from the jewel garden. Now this has got rich, dark, almost chocolate flowers and is at its best in April and May. And it's called geranium phaeum. And I've cut this back. It will grow about 3 foot tall. Now geranium phaeum will take a certain amount of damp shade. Now this is a vigorous geranium, so great to fill larger areas in the shade, but not so good if you've only got a small space and you just want that hit of colour. I've got another geranium here, which is Geranium macrorhizum spessart. Now this is slightly less vigorous and has a very different flower. And it's a superb geranium for dry shade. And it's beautiful. The bees love it. They are one of the most useful plants that you can grow in the garden. Oh, the soil is a little bit better up the top. Perfect. Pop that in. And that will be completely happy. The essence is to cover that soil, because even though it's bare and knobbly and looks as though nothing will grow, believe you me, the weeds will fill it up. It is really, really important that whatever you plant at this time of year and for the rest of the year, that you give it a good soak. Absolutely drench it, and then you need never water it again. And that does two things. It gives it water that it can tap into over the first few weeks of its growth, and also makes the contact between the soil and the roots much closer. Now, it's time to see the last of today's films sent in by you. And it comes from Dr. Sarah Taylor from Staffordshire, who wants to share with us her secret of the perfect lawn.
Hi, my name's Sarah and I'm an ecology lecturer, and my little video short is to encourage you to not manicure lawns to within an inch of their lives. The bulk of my garden is laid to lawn, and us Brits are obsessed with our lawns. Tram lines, lush green colours, and with lockdown the temptation is to get that lawnmower out. But the lawn is actually an ecological desert for wildlife. So I started experimenting with leaving areas unmown and creating these fabulous pathways through the lawn, adding texture, dynamic shapes and movements. When I first started in this, I wanted to create a wildflower meadow, but it quickly became apparent that the deep shade cast by this beautiful sycamore tree would not allow this kind of thing to be established. It's all about matching the species that you grow to the conditions that you have in your garden. And the reality is, I have a woodland garden, not an open sunny wildflower meadow. So instead I've got things like hogweed and this knapweed, which is absolutely thriving, and some bluebells, Spanish I'm afraid. They appeared naturally when I stopped mowing. And some meadow plants do like it here. We can see that this buttercup is very happy and one flower has just appeared. So I hope I've inspired you to mismanage your lawn too.
I'm very happy to see somebody else mismanaging a lawn. In fact, I like lawns. Lawns are a good thing, but they're not always necessary. There are times when, by converting a lawn into longer grass, you can make your garden more beautiful. And this area here is a good example. For about 20 years, we mowed this every week, and it was a wide path or a narrow lawn, whatever you want to call it, a link between the cottage garden and the damp garden. But about 3 years ago, we decided to change things. We've planted in snowdrops, there's Alcamilla mollis, we have fritillaries, and now this year we've planted lots of these white camasias, which are just beginning to flower. And the idea is to have this rich environment, almost like a flower border, in amongst the grass. And then in August, the whole lot gets cut, and then we mow it like a lawn for the rest of summer. And if you want wild flowers in long grass, the only important thing is to not cut it between the middle of March and August. And that means that not only is it beautiful, but it's really easy too. I don't know about you, but I nearly always have some seed potatoes left over. I either buy too many or I run out of space. But a good way of using up seed potatoes, even now, is to grow them in a container. And a bag is perfectly good. These are actually potting bags, but any strong bag will do the job. Do make sure it's got holes in the bottom for drainage. Put some compost in the bottom. About 6 inches is ideal. The tubers that I've got left are a variety called pink fir apple. You can see that they're unusually long, they're sausage-shaped, and they are an absolutely delicious potato, very waxy, main crop, so you don't need to harvest them until October. The one weakness they have is that they are prone to potato blight. Now, in a bag that size, I don't want to put in more than 2 tubers. It's tempting to put in more, but resist it, because all that will happen is you'll just get lots and lots of tiny little potatoes. So we'll put 2 tubers in, place them down, cover them up, and all I need to do is literally cover them. Now, the bag should go somewhere warm and sunny. The warmth is more important than anything else at this stage. Keep it watered, and as the foliage grows, you add soil on top of it. So you keep topping it up until you're right up to the brim. You'll have growth up the top there, and come October, we can see what sort of harvest we've got. Right, I will put these to one side and water them, and while I'm doing that, here's some jobs you can do this weekend. Garlic has a tendency to run to seed in response to very dry, hot, or even very cold weather at this time of year. And this takes goodness from the bulb. So cut off these flowering scapes with a knife, and that will allow the bulbs more time to develop. Although you shouldn't cut hedges yet because birds are still nesting, if you lightly trim the gaps between hedges, the entrances and the exits, this sharpens up the whole garden, and then you can put the hedge cuttings on the compost heap. A lot of plants, like this Persicaria virginiana, have seedlings growing all around its base. If you dig up these seedlings, pot them on individually and grow them on, you can spread them out across the garden and get yourself scores of your favourite plants for free. I am aware that across the country, gardens are working at very different timescales at this time of year. So if you're down in the far south, your roses are probably at their very best, whereas here at Longmeadow, they haven't really begun. And if you're in the far north of Scotland, you're still in spring and summer is a few weeks away. But here in the cottage garden, the lupins are at their best. And you can see some of them are going over. And when they've finished and you've got seed pods all the way up, cut it back down to the ground. And then you'll get fresh spikes of flowers growing. But I'm just going to stake this, because if you do get bad weather, the whole lot can come tumbling down. So if I just put that in there like that and tuck this one round, right, those will be supported. And if this good weather remains for a few more days, the roses here in the cottage garden are poised to explode into glorious colour. But not today, I'm afraid, because we've run out of time. I will see you back here at Longmeadow at 9 o'clock next Friday. So until then, bye-bye.